Good evening and welcome. My name is Ben Thielemeyer. I'm Senior Manager of Communications and Marketing for the Clinton Foundation. And on behalf of my colleagues, as well as the Clinton Presidential Library and the Clinton School of Public Service, I want to thank you for joining us here for our Clinton Presidential Center Presents program. Jake, can we get a little more audio, please? I'd also like to say a special thank you to our Clinton Center members and donors for their generous support for all the work that we do here at the Clinton Center. Before we get started, please silence your cell phones. We'd appreciate that. During my tenure at the Clinton Center, we've had not one, but two dinosaur exhibitions. In both, we've included information about the importance of the Antiquities Act of 1906, which grants U.S. presidents the authority to preserve and protect landmarks, structures, and lands. It has played a significant role in aiding the discovery and preservation of dinosaur bones and fossils. During tonight's program, the Monumental Legacy of the Antiquities Act, Dinosaurs and More, we'll really dig in with our special guest. Did you get it? Dig in with our special guest, Clinton administration alumnus and professor Mark Squillace. Mark is the Raphael J. Moses Professor of Natural Resources Law at the University of Colorado Law School, serves as director of Colorado Law's Natural Resources Law Center from 2005 to 2013, is a former Fulbright scholar and the author or co-author of numerous articles and books on water resources law, public lands, natural resources, and environmental law and policy. And in 2000, he took leave from law teaching to serve as special assistant to the solicitor at the U.S. Department of the Interior, where he worked directly with Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt on a wide range of legal and policy issues, including the designation of national monuments under the Antiquities Act of 1906. So the man is an expert. My friend and colleague, Dr. Jay Barth, who serves as the director of the Clinton Presidential Library Museum, will close tonight's program at the end. Please help me welcome Professor Mark Squillace to the stage.
Thank you, Ben. It's a real pleasure for me to be here at the Clinton Presidential Library, and thanks to Jay and others who've invited me and welcomed me to this program. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you about one of my favorite laws, the Antiquities Act. As Ben mentioned, I had worked for the Clinton administration during the final year of that administration, and you may not remember all of this, or you may remember a little bit about it, but during that last year, in the year 2000, the Clinton administration, largely through the efforts of Secretary Babbitt, had designated something in the order of 21 national monuments. Some of them were extensions of existing monuments and others, but it kept me busy. I was doing a lot of traveling with Secretary Babbitt to the different areas. We can maybe talk about that a little bit. Anyway, it was really a rewarding experience, and I learned a lot about our public lands and the Antiquities Act, and I hope to share just a tiny part of what I've learned tonight. There are a lot of complicated issues. I'm going to dabble in a few of them and show you some nice pictures, I hope, about some of the Antiquities Act. So maybe I'll go back here just for a minute here and mention that these are all photos from various national monuments that were designated under the Antiquities Act, and we can go back at the end and have a quiz to see how many of you can identify these national monuments. I guess you can identify the Statue of Liberty. That's the easy one. The others might be a little bit harder. So I want to start really by looking at the key language in the statute with you. And here it is, not very complicated. President gets to proclaim national monuments. There are some restrictions. You can proclaim a national monument for a historic landmark, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest. They have to be on lands that are owned or controlled by the government of the United States, and they have to be the smallest area compatible with the open care and management of the objects that are identified in the proclamation. Just one little note, I'm going to come back to some of the language here in the discussion, but I won't be coming back to this one issue about owned or controlled by the government of the United States, but I want to just touch on that for a moment, because it's kind of an interesting problem. What happens if you're out in the territorial seas? So there have been a number of monuments that have been declared basically up to 200 miles out from the shore. So if you know anything about sort of who owns the bed of our seas, the states generally own up to 3 miles out under a law called the Submerged Lands Act, but between 3 miles and 200 miles under international law, the sovereign nation that is adjacent to that land owns the territory, or at least has certain rights in that territory. They don't necessarily own the land, because you have to leave the area open to boats and fishing and various kinds of things that could be done by multiple nations. But there was a really interesting legal debate about whether or not you could designate a national monument in these areas, and the Justice Department determined that you could, and that um, decision has largely been upheld by the courts. So we have some really significant monuments now on the open seas, involving coral reefs and other kinds of things like that. And there's just some really interesting stories that I got involved in when I was working with Secretary Babbitt on some of those issues. All right, I want to dig into some of this here. First, looking at how did we get to this Antiquities Act? What happened that led us to pass this law called the Antiquities Act? It was largely and somewhat interestingly, I think, the looting that was being done not by pot hunters, although there was some of that going on. It was by major museums, not just in the United States, in some other countries as well. They were basically going down to places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon and just wholesale lifting things out from the public lands and taking them back to their museums. And Congressman John Lacey from Iowa had major concerns about what was going on, felt like something needed to be done. He was chair of the House Committee on Public Lands, and he felt like it was his responsibility to deal with that issue. And so there were these competing bills that started to get thrown around in his committee. Some of them were pretty narrow. They were going to allow designation of what I sometimes call postage stamp size monuments. They were limited in some cases to 320 acres or 640 acres. 640 acres, by the way, if you don't know, is basically 1 square mile. So if you can kind of visualize that, that's the biggest that you could have had a monument under some of these proposed bills. But what would happen, what was kind of interesting, is that the Department of the Interior wanted a lot more. They wanted the president to be able to designate national parks. And so there was this discussion, debate, disagreement, I guess, that was going on. I thought I'd just show you the key players in this debate. So there's John Lacey on your left. And Lacey was the congressman I mentioned. The two directors of the General Land Office were these Interior Department employees. The General Land Office is no longer in existence, but it is basically now the Bureau of Land Management that manages a lot of our public lands. And they were really supporting broader kind of legislative language. Edgar Lee Hewitt was basically this guy who became friends with Lacey, and Lacey wanted to learn more about the antiquities that could be lost on our public lands. So Hewitt took him out to New Mexico and some other places to show him some of these areas that were being looted. And Lacey ended up trusting Hewitt to draft the legislation. And Hewitt, I think, was trying to do a good job of reaching a reasonable compromise between the two camps, if you will, the ones who wanted a smaller designation and the ones who wanted actually national parks. So we didn't get national park language, but we got this really interesting language about objects of historic and scientific interest. And it turns out that that's fairly broad language, at least as it's been interpreted. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of where we are and how we got there. So when we just think about the legacy of the Antiquities Act, it's really remarkable, really remarkable. 163 national monuments, I believe, have been designated. About 30 of those, maybe 33 of those now, have been basically moved into national parks or other kinds of protected status. And you can see from just some of the examples that I've put up here on the board, some of our most treasured national parks began as national monuments. Indeed, they might look a lot different today had the presidents not had the foresight to designate them first as a national monument. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Grand Canyon here in a minute. There's a great story, I'll tell a little bit about it, about Mount Olympus, a national monument, which is now Olympic National Park in the state of Washington. But you can see all the other amazing places that we protected under the Antiquities Act. And this is just a handful, of course, of the monuments that are there. I thought I should mention the most recent monument that was just declared a couple of weeks ago by President Biden, the Ba Nawavjo Itakukveni. I think I sort of got that right. And it was a monument that was basically designated to protect the southern border of the Grand Canyon from uranium mining and other kinds of development. So there was a lot of concern about new uranium claims that were being filed in this area on public lands, and the Biden administration decided to use the Antiquities Act to protect this area. It's almost 1 million acres in size, so it's a huge additional area that's been protected immediately adjacent to Grand Canyon National Park. And the sort of English name, if you will, is the ancient footprints of the Grand Canyon. These Indian names that are in the name of the official name of the monument are from the Havasupai tribe and the Hopi tribe, both of which have strong interests in that area. All right, so that's just a little bit of the legacy. I think it's just really interesting to talk about the controversies under the Antiquities Act. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on this. I don't want to get too overwhelmed with some of the details because there's a lot to talk about here. But I thought I should talk a little bit about the Grand Canyon. That's sort of the original one that created a lot of controversy. And there's a famous decision from the US Supreme Court about it, which is really important. Also, the Mount Olympus National Monument that I mentioned briefly before. Mount Olympus is interesting because Teddy Roosevelt designated it a couple of days, maybe it was a day before he left office in 1906. And it was cut in half essentially by Woodrow Wilson about 10 years later. And this was really controversial at the time. There was no litigation over the decision. And I happen to think, and I'll be talking about this a little bit in a moment, I happen to think that was an illegal decision by Woodrow Wilson, but it was never challenged in court. Really interesting. I think it was done largely at the behest of the mineral industry and the timber industry. They basically took a lot of the national forest out of the monument and left sort of the alpine areas that were sort of above the timberline in those areas. So somewhat problematic, I think, in terms of protecting the biological resources of that area, including, ironically, what are called Roosevelt elk. They were actually named after Teddy Roosevelt, who designated the monument originally. Good news is that is now Olympic National Park, and much of that land was restored to the park. It started off, as you saw, for about 600,000 acres, went down to about 300,000 acres, and it's now about 1 million acres of national park up there in Washington. So an interesting case. There's a great story about the Jackson Hole National Monument. I can't get into all the details, but it's really an interesting story. So this is now a big part, the main part, I would say, of the Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. And the Wyoming delegation was so furious about Franklin Roosevelt's designation of Jackson Hole that they basically held up funding for years so that the monument was there, but they couldn't really fund it. It's kind of an interesting story, and I don't really understand why there was so much opposition. John D. Rockefeller had offered to donate like 32,000 acres to the Park Service of prime parkland if the president would protect the area. And this was Franklin Roosevelt at the time, and Roosevelt decided to, basically, Rockefeller told him he's going to sell the land if the president won't designate a monument. So Roosevelt decided he was going to do it, and he ended up designating 220,000 acres, 221,000 acres of land, including the Roosevelt designation, as part of this Jackson Hole National Monument. As I said, it's now part of the national park. Really interesting story. One of my favorite stories, sorry to go into all these details, but they're kind of fun. Millward Simpson was senator of Wyoming at the time. Millward's son was Al Simpson, whose name may be more familiar to you. Al Simpson was later a senator from Wyoming. But at the time, Harold Ickes was the Secretary of the Interior under Franklin Roosevelt, and Millward decided to take his son, Al, to go meet Harold Ickes. And the famous story, at least the story that Alan Simpson's brother told me, is that Al went in to see Harold Ickes and he refused to shake his hand because of the national monument that had been proposed. It's kind of a funny story, but what the sort of end of the story is that Al Simpson, to his great credit, later said that this was the best thing that ever happened to Wyoming, and he regrets his opposition to the national monument. And of course, if you spend any time up in the Grand Teton National Park and in the Jackson area, it's a gorgeous area. One would like to think that we want to keep that in parkland. But a lot of these cases, there's just so many interesting stories. The Alaska monuments are really interesting. 56 million acres were protected under the Antiquities Act by Jimmy Carter. And that land was really designated as national monument to force Congress to protect all these amazing lands in Alaska. And it worked. Congress had stalled out. They weren't able to get any legislation through. There was a lot of effort to name some new national parks and wildlife refuges. And in the end, I think largely because of these monuments, Congress passed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, ANILCA, really important law that designated over 100 million acres as national parks and national wildlife refuges and other protected lands. And I really do think that a lot of the reason for that was because of the monuments that Carter designated. Those were the only monuments that Carter designated, by the way, during his tenure, but they were big ones. And so really important. And then, of course, we have the Grand Staircase and Bears Ears monuments. Grand Staircase, the one we'll be talking about a little bit later today in some detail because of the dinosaurs. Really interesting just because of the back and forth that's been happening, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Clinton designates it in 1996. This was before I ever got to Interior. It was really controversial, by the way, right from the get-go. They actually hung Bill Clinton and Bruce Babbitt in effigy in the little town of Kanab near the monument. It was very controversial, but it's really an interesting story about how these things go. And if you followed, and I spent a lot of time down in the Grand Staircase area, it's just a beautiful area. If you ever have a chance to go down there, I encourage you to do it. But what's happened to that economy in that area is it's been totally transformed. They get something like 800,000 visitors to the monument now. And the little towns that used to be these sort of sleepy kind of towns that really didn't have much going on now, they're kind of thriving now. And at the time, of course, the monument's designated, the state's all opposed, a lot of the locals are opposed, and now all of a sudden you go down there and you look in the restaurant windows and the hotels, and they all have signs supporting the original monument. You know, I mean, it's just changed the whole attitude because it's transformed the economy literally in those areas. So it's pretty interesting to see the transformation. But of course, we'll get to this in a little bit, but Trump cut the monument in half pretty much in 2017, and Biden has now restored it to what it was before. Very interesting story. Same thing happened with Bears Ears, and we'll talk about that again. Bears Ears was the Obama monument that came up. All right, so I mentioned the Grand Canyon earlier, and I kind of skipped over it in terms of the stories, but it's worth a short story here as well, because what happened in the Grand Canyon was that the president, this was Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. So Roosevelt was really an interesting guy in this area. I think that the reason that we have the Antiquities Act that we have today is at least in part because of Teddy Roosevelt. I had his picture up there for a reason a little bit earlier, because he was president when the Antiquities Act was passed. The first monument that Roosevelt designates is Devil's Tower National Monument in Wyoming, that big tower that you probably, you've probably seen pictures of. And it's, it's an interesting place, but it's not the kind of thing maybe that you'd expect for the first monument that was ever designated. But what was interesting was that Teddy saw that you could use that language, that broad language about objects of historic and scientific interest, to essentially designate landscapes, large areas that had ecosystems associated with them. And he designated 800,000 acres of the Grand Canyon as a national monument. And it was an interesting story because Ralph Henry Cameron, the Cameron of the famous case that went to the Supreme Court, he had located these mining claims along the Bright Angel Trail, which is, anybody's been there, you may have heard of the Bright Angel Trail, but it's the main trail that goes from the South Rim down to the river. It's a pretty tough trail, rugged trail to get down there. But the Santa Fe Railroad had set up a hotel at the South Rim and invited people out. You could take the train out there, and then you could hike down to the canyon. But Cameron had located some mining claims that were almost certainly invalid, right on the blocking the trail essentially. And he was charging people $1 to go through his mining claims, his invalid mining claims. There wasn't a lot of law out there at this time, right? So people wanted to get through, they had to pay Cameron. And so people were paying him, but the hotel got a lot of complaints, as you might imagine, from the people who were staying at the hotel. And so they complained to the Justice Department. The Justice Department had the claims declared invalid. Cameron didn't care. He kept charging people. And eventually this case ended up in court, ended up in the US Supreme Court. And one of Cameron's main arguments was, well, you're supposed to designate the smallest area compatible with protecting, these scientific and historic objects that you've designated. The Supreme Court said, looks like a scientific and historic object to us. And you can see the language that they used, very broad language, recognizing that the Grand Canyon, one of the greatest eroded canyons in the United States, if not the world, right? And seems to have scientific and historic interest to all of us. And so this really, I think, has set the stage for a lot of the future monument designations that are at this sort of landscape level. These huge monuments that have been designated over the years. I mentioned the Mount Olympus National Monument that was also designated by Roosevelt, 600,000 acres. So really interesting sort of developments as a result of this case. All right, I'm kind of jumping ahead now, but let me just tell you why I'm jumping ahead. First of all, you should recognize that the Antiquities Act historically was this really bipartisan piece of legislation. There were a lot of great monuments designated by Democrats and Republicans. Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover were really great in designating national monuments all over the country. And so I don't want this to seem like this was just the Democrats designating these monuments. It wasn't. But it kind of came to a bit of a halt right at the end of the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Things just were slowing down. There weren't many new monuments that were being designated after that. Truman, I think, did a few little things. Eisenhower designated one important monument, which was the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. If any of you have been to Washington, you may know the C&O Canal, as it's called. It's really cool. It's a great resource, but it's somewhat unique and unusual, that goes right along the Potomac River. But that's really the only thing that Eisenhower did. Johnson, another interesting story, Johnson designated the Marble Canyon on the Colorado River. Really fascinating story, because Stuart Udall, the Secretary of the Interior at the time, had actually proposed to build a dam at Marble Canyon that was going to literally destroy a major part of what is now the Grand Canyon. And Stuart Udall was known as this great conservationist, and so a lot of people were really upset. Why was he doing this? It was because it was going to generate power so that they get water to Phoenix through the Central Arizona Project. It's a long story, but in any event, this decision was so controversial that Stuart Udall decided he had to take a trip down the river, and so he did. He floated the Grand Canyon and came back from the trip and said he made a mistake, and convinced convinced Lyndon Johnson to designate the Marble Canyon as a national monument, and it later became part of Grand Canyon National Park. So just some really great, I think, interesting stories about this. I want to just say one other thing about Johnson and Stuart Udall. Stuart Udall wanted to designate 17 major monuments at the end of the Johnson administration, and Johnson refused. The only one he did was Marble Canyon. And Johnson actually almost fired Stuart Udall like 2 days before the end of his administration, which would have been kind of strange. They ended up sort of working it out, but they didn't get any of these monuments. A lot of these came back then under the Clinton administration, as we're going to see. So not a lot going on. John Kennedy did a couple little things for his buddy Hugh Downs. That's another story, but nothing very significant during that time. Nixon never did anything under the Antiquities Act. Carter did the big Alaska monuments, but not a whole lot more than that. So we were just not getting a lot going under the Antiquities Act. It almost felt like people had kind of forgotten about it and the amazing authority that the president has to protect these public lands. And I think the thing that changed was Bruce Babbitt. And I'm not taking anything away from Bill Clinton, except to say that Bruce Babbitt was the sort of engine behind this effort. Brett Babbitt, you may know, had been the governor of Arizona, had run for president himself. He was a smart guy. He really knew the public lands. He cared deeply about the public lands. And he knew about some areas that he thought were worthy of protection. And there's a famous story of Babbitt, who was not that close to Clinton. They were both former governors. They knew each other pretty well, but they weren't that tight, I suppose, as politicians go. But of course, he would be going to the White House for various dinners and other events, and he would bring a card with him, a big index card with him. And on one side, it would have all the monuments that were designated by Teddy Roosevelt, and on the other side, it would have Grand Staircase-Escalante. That's all, because that's all Clinton had done in his first term. And it was this message, it's time to do it. And of course, Grand Staircase-Escalante, despite the controversy in Utah, turned out to be wildly popular in the rest of the country. Clinton actually won Arizona in 1996. He hadn't won it in 1992, but he won it in that second election. I don't know if it was because of Grand Staircase, but he actually did the announcement for Grand Staircase in Arizona. He didn't do it in Utah, even though the monument was entirely in Utah. So Clinton, I think, just felt like it was politically smart to sort of go along with some of these monuments. And he had a guy, Bruce Babbitt, who was really able to do it well. I should mention also John Podesta here, Clinton's chief of staff, who was and continues to be a real strong conservationist. And Podesta was in the White House, and he was the guy we would go to make sure we could get our things done. I mean, and get them through the president, because the president had to sign these proclamations, obviously. And Podesta was just a great ally for this effort. All right. So then we've got the Bears Ears Monument. An interesting story here, because it was this monument, this effort basically to involve the Native American communities down there. A lot of Native American communities down by Bears Ears. It's in southeastern Utah. It's a really amazing area. There are some incredible canyons in this particular area. And the Indians really pushed for this, pushed hard, came up with their own proposal and asked the Interior Department under Obama to designate this monument. And ultimately he did. He didn't designate as much as they had wanted, but he did suggest that maybe we need to look at something like a co-stewardship operation here. There's a lot of talk right now. You may have heard the phrase co-management. I think they've gone to this other phrase, co-stewardship now. Remember, this is federal public lands. The federal government cannot turn the management over to a third party, even if it's a Native American community, but you can certainly engage in a significant way with people who have a real attachment to the land. And that's what we're seeing happening with this particular monument. Again, this is one of those that was originally designated by Obama. I think I've got the numbers maybe on the next slide. Yeah, so here's what happened to the two big monuments in southern Utah, Grand Staircase and Bears Ears. Grand Staircase shrunk in half, essentially. Really a sort of an odd thing, because Congress had basically reaffirmed the Grand Staircase monument when it allowed some transfers and exchanges of land. So it was an odd thing for Trump to think that he could simply change what Congress had effectively done. I thought they had basically confirmed that monument. We can talk about that a little bit more. But Bears Ears was the one that he really went after. So Bears Ears had originally been designated as a little over 1.3 million acres of land, and Trump shrunk it down to 201,000 acres of land, so a massive 85% reduction in the amount of land that was being protected. Kind of really highly problematic in terms of the resources that they were trying to protect in this particular area. And Biden has now restored all of that monument and a little bit more. So he didn't go as far as the tribes had wanted him to go, but he did go almost well past what Obama had originally done by about 10,000 acres. So both of these monuments are now restored. And I don't think we're going to see changes. I mean, obviously we have an election coming up next year and we'll see what happens, but it feels more and more like these lands are being protected for long enough that it's going to be really hard to reverse these decisions. We saw what happened down in the Grand Staircase-Escalante with public opinion, even in Utah. And I think that's likely to happen in Bears Ears as well. All right. So here's just the information about what happened there. The state of Utah continues to be hostile to these decisions by President Biden. They've been trying to block them. And Utah sued, and they recently lost that lawsuit. A federal judge in Utah basically dismissed the lawsuit against the state, and that decision is now on appeal. There is a real concern now about whether a case like this might go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. the U.S. Supreme Court has, and particularly Justice Roberts, the Chief Judge, has said some things that call into question some of the other opinions about the Antiquities Act, and there is concern that if this goes to the Supreme Court, they could issue a narrow ruling about the scope of the Antiquities Act. Time will tell. I hope that doesn't happen, but we're going to have to watch that. Okay, so this just as an example, this is Peekaboo Gulch in Grand Staircase-Escalante. You can actually walk through those little openings. It's pretty cool. This is a favorite for a lot of kids that like to go down with their parents. It's just really fun to kind of walk through these narrow areas. But this was outside the Trump boundaries. It was inside the original boundaries, and it's back in now with the new proclamation from President Biden. And just interesting, this is now Bears Ears. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is some cliff dwellings in the Bears Ears National Monument. Again, some of these were taken out of the Bears Ears Monument when Trump shrunk the monument, and they're back in now. So good news, I think, for us. And just an interesting sort of fact, I mean, we're going to be talking about dinosaurs a little bit more, but lots of fossils in this area. This large area is part of what's called the Morrison Formation. It's an area that was where the sedimentary rocks basically settled during the Jurassic period. This is basically covers a whole area from Canada down to Mexico, but there are a lot of hot spots basically within the Morrison Formation. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. Bears Ears is not as rich from an archaeological perspective as Grand Staircase, as we're going to see, but still you can see some amazing things that we're finding in the Bears Ears area. And this is just an example of a fossil that was found in the area that had been cut out of the monument by President Trump. Of course, it's back in now, but it just shows you the importance of these monuments for protecting these kinds of resources. Pretty cool. There's a picture of what the phytosaur actually looks like from that skeleton that we see there. Okay, so as I said, there are a lot of interesting legal issues that we could talk about here, and if you have questions, hopefully we can get into some of them. But the one I kind of wanted to focus on, because it's been such a big issue in the context of Grand Staircase and Bears Ears, is this question of whether the presidents even have authority to modify or rescind a proclamation that was issued by a predecessor. And no big surprise here, I don't think the president has that two-way authority. Why do I say that? Well, let's start with the property clause of the Constitution, okay? So it's crystal clear that the property clause gives the power over our public lands and all public property to the Congress, right? And that power, according to the Supreme Court, is without limitations. But Congress can delegate that power to an agency. Delegations are supposed to be construed narrowly. So you remember on one of those first slides that I showed you, what the Antiquities Act says is that the president can reserve lands. What does that mean? The president can reserve lands. What it means is that he basically can set aside those lands so that they are not, they cannot be used under various laws like the mining laws or the mineral leasing laws or certain other laws. The president can decide what to allow or not allow in any of these areas that he is reserving as a national monument. And so we typically get these monument proclamations that make these monuments off limits to motorized vehicles, to new rights of way, to mining claims, to oil and gas leasing and other forms of mineral leasing. All that stuff is being protected. The question here is whether you can reverse any of that. Can you shrink the monument like Trump purportedly did? I don't think that he had that authority, which I'm going to get to. Can you modify the monument? Can you say, okay, well, Obama didn't allow mining in the monument. I'm going to allow mining. We'll just keep the monument, but I'll allow mining. Can you do any of these things? Or is it one-way authority? Excuse me. So let's take a look. So here you can see that there are these two earlier pieces of legislation that are pretty much contemporaneous with the Antiquities Act. Well, one's earlier and one's actually later. So the Forest Service Organic Act is, it's what, 9 years earlier than the Antiquities Act. And in that law, Congress specifically said that the president could establish a reserve or reduce the area or change the boundary lines of such reserve, or vacate altogether in order creating a reserve. So under this law, you could create a forest reserve and you could get rid of it, you could change it, you could modify it, whatever. Same with the Pickett Act. The Pickett Act indicates that the president can withdraw public lands from settlement, location, sale, or entry for multiple purposes until revoked by him or by an act of Congress. And so the simple legal argument here is that when Congress wanted to give the president the authority to go two ways, to both reserve a monument and to modify or shrink the monument, it said so, as it did under these two laws. And it only said you could reserve the monuments under the Antiquities Act. And there's a good reason for this, right? This is not really constraining the president the sort of protection of our public lands in any significant way. If Congress thought that the president had made a mistake, they can always reverse these decisions. Nothing prevents the Congress from making a decision to reverse the decision. In fact, they almost never have. There are a few tiny monuments that were turned over to some states, or they lost the objects that were being protected, and so they were basically discontinued by the Congress. But there has been no major monument that has ever been reversed by the Congress, ever. And so they tried to do it with Grand Staircase and Bears, but it never went anywhere, right? So it seems to me that that these arguments are really pretty compelling. It's never been decided by a court. As you might expect, there was litigation when Trump shrunk Bears Ears and Grand Staircase. I actually wrote one of the amicus briefs in that case. We did amicus briefs for law professors, and I'm a law professor, so I wrote one of the briefs involving the Grand Staircase case. Guess where it's pending? It's been pending for, I think, like 6 years now, maybe longer. It's pending before which judge? Judge Chutkan, the judge who's handling the Trump litigation right now. I don't know why she hasn't ruled on any of our motions or any of our briefs, but that case has been sitting there forever. Of course, it's arguably moot now because Biden has restored the monuments, but she hasn't said so, and we still don't know. We kind of really wanted a decision. We thought we had a pretty good legal argument. We wanted a decision from the judge to say that presidents can't reverse monument decisions, that what Trump did was illegal, was wrong. We don't have that. Looks like we're not going to get it now because of what's happened, but it's a really important issue that is likely to come up again, and we'll just have to see how it plays out. I should mention I've written about this issue a couple of times, so I'm really keen on this particular issue. I mean, there's also this argument under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, a law we call FLPMA. It's the law that basically governs the Bureau of Land Management and how it works. FLPMA is really interesting because in FLPMA, Congress basically repealed all the laws that allowed for withdrawals of land, including like the Pickett Act, which we saw a moment ago. The Forest Reserve Act had already been repealed. The only one they really preserved was the Antiquities Act. And actually, the commission that had asked the Congress to pass the law wanted to repeal the Antiquities Act, but Congress refused to do it. So this is sort of the saving law that we have now that gives the president this really broad authority. And the language from the House report on the bill specifically says that they're reserving to Congress the authority to modify and revoke withdrawals of national monuments. So this further, I think, supports our claim that Congress did not want the Antiquities Act to go both ways. Of course, this is a later law, so it can be there. And it just, I think, really makes good sense. I mean, if you think about what's going on here, we're talking about protecting public land resources. Remember what was happening with the archaeological sites, things like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, they were getting looted. And so the fact that the president is protecting them makes a lot of sense. And if Congress, for whatever reason, thinks they shouldn't be protected any longer, it can do it. But we don't want to sort of lose these protections because we get a new president in who, for whatever reason, for political reasons, decides to shrink those monuments. Leave it to Congress. You know, the status quo of protection seems to make a lot of sense from a public policy perspective because these are resources that many people think need to be protected. Anyway, again, this hasn't been decided by any court at this time, but it's one of these arguments that we're still floating around. I've already mentioned the smallest area compatible argument in the context of the um, the Grand Canyon case. But this issue came up again in the Utah case that was just pending, and the court basically rejected it. So this was a lower court. This wasn't the Supreme Court. But at least for now, the courts seem to be in agreement that an object of historic or scientific interest can include a whole landscape. And one of the really interesting issues in Bears Ears is this question about whether a cultural landscape can exist. The argument in Bears Ears are that there are like 100,000 archaeological sites in that area, and they are related. You don't think about them in isolation. You have to think about them as a whole ecosystem, if you will, holistically. And so that's a landscape, a cultural landscape that needs to be protected as an object of historic or scientific interest. Again, the court hasn't ruled on that issue, but it's a pretty interesting kind of problem. All right. I think I'm going to maybe skip this stuff because I want to save some time for questions, and I want to get to dinosaurs as well. But there's some interesting stuff going on with other litigation. The president is not an agency for purposes of federal law. Raises interesting questions about how you sue the president when he issues one of these proclamations. The courts have generally allowed it, but it's a little bit tricky, and so it raises some interesting questions. And I'm happy to talk about it if people want to hear more about it. But let's talk briefly about dinosaurs in the time that I have left. That's what I'm supposed to be talking about, Jay, isn't it? Sorry about that. Okay, so let's go to dinosaurs. So we've got two monuments, basically. Dinosaur National Monument, obviously originally designated by Woodrow Wilson in 1915. It's only 80 acres at that time. And it's just around this one little quarry called the Carnegie Quarry. It's the Carnegie Quarry because the Carnegie Foundation and Museum was basically mining this quarry for the dinosaur bones that they were finding there. It's in Utah, entirely in Utah, near a little town called Jensen, Utah, and it's a pretty remarkable area. 26 full dinosaur skeletons have been found there. 10 different species have been found there. Franklin Roosevelt expanded the monument in 1938 to encompass more than 200,000 acres. So what he did was he included the Green and Yampa rivers, mostly in Colorado now, but also in another part of Utah. So it's a much bigger monument than it was then. And it's a pretty cool monument, I think. They have a really nice visitor center there. This is just a mural from the wall at the Dinosaur National Monument. It's called the Morrison Mural, and remember that it's the Morrison Formation where a lot of these things are found. So just kind of interesting. These dinosaur sites are all over, but as I said, there are a few hot spots like this Carnegie Quarry, and those are some of the dinosaurs that were found there. If you just want to get situated geographically, you can see the monument here, and you can kind of see, if you look closely, that Utah-Colorado border there. And the biggest part of the monument is now in Colorado, although the quarry, you can see, is in the state of Utah, and that's kind of where it exists right now. It's a very popular area for boating, for river rafting. So that both the Yampa River and the Green River are very popular rafting areas, and so Dinosaur National Monument is very popular for these sports as well as for the dinosaurs that are there. Okay, the really cool story is, there is one, and I only have a few minutes here, but is Grand Staircase-Escalante, because you know, at the time, so I had been going down to Grand Staircase-Escalante for decades, literally decades. I went to law school at the University of Utah and started going down to that area way back in the late 1970s. There was actually no paved road down into that area. I had to go over this really dangerous dirt road. It was really dangerous, especially in rain, because it would turn into this slick area through the mountains. But it was an amazing area, and still is. But a lot of it was the last place in the lower 48 to even be mapped. So you can imagine how remote this area was for so many years. And so people didn't really know what was there, except if you went down into this area, you found these amazing canyons where you could hike. And there were a lot of perennial streams. This is the desert, but it's kind of the high desert. And these perennial streams they were flowing year round. You could hike and camp. You could always find shade because you're in these deep canyons. So it might be 95 degrees out temperature-wise, but you could get in the water, you could be in the shade. It really was a pleasant place to recreate. And part of what happens is the sort of conservation community in Utah really targeted this area for conservation. And they finally convinced Bill Clinton that he needed to do something. They convinced Bruce Babbitt, I guess, maybe better said. And Babbitt convinced Clinton that they should designate this area. Again, it's almost 2 million acres now, this area, Grand Staircase-Escalante, and it has some amazing resources, but we didn't even really know about the dinosaurs when this was designated. This came kind of later, and it's just remarkable. So you can see some of the information that I pulled off of their website now. It describes this a rich trove of fossils from the Comparowitz Plateau. I'll show you the sort of map of that area. These fossils preserved there include articulated skeletons, fossilized skin, and plants so shockingly fresh that their delicate leaves can be peeled right off the rocks. I mean, it's just remarkable that this stuff has been down there. Nobody knew about it. The monument gets designated and people start exploring it more, and now we see all these amazing resources there. Some of the greatest crocodile and turtle diversity in the ancient world, 6 crocodile species, 17 turtle species. You know, this other one 3-foot-long turtle discovered recently died pregnant, her body full of eggs. It's just amazing stuff that they found in this area. I think I probably didn't mention this other part about well, maybe it's coming up in the next slide, but the dinosaurs that we found down there are pretty amazing. Yeah, so that you can see it's called the Shangri-La of dinosaurs now. This was not known at the time that the National Monument was designated, and now you can see all these amazing, amazing kinds of resources that we're discovering down there. And I just really want to show you some pictures. So here's the slide I was thinking of: 30 distinct species of dinosaurs, or 15 new dinosaurs, basically, about 30 distinct species in this area. 15 dinosaurs that we've never discovered anywhere else, just in this one Comparowitz Plateau. And just some of the most amazing things you can imagine. This is just a little photo from the website about 5 of the dinosaurs that have been found there. And, you know, they're maybe a little bit familiar, but you can see they're all a little bit different from the dinosaurs we're mostly familiar with, because these are, in many cases, very new types of dinosaurs. And I want to just leave you with just a few more photos about some of the dinosaurs down there. So just to situate you again, this is right on the Utah-Arizona border. And you can see the Comparowitz Plateau, which is where the dinosaur digs are. And the Escalante Canyons is a little bit northeast of there. That's the sort of main hiking area where people go. Comparowitz is the main area where people look for these dinosaur bones. And then Vermilion Cliffs is another recreation area in Grand Staircase. But you can see how it's situated right adjacent to Bryce Canyon National Park. And on the other side is Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. So that whole area has really been conserved now. One last thing I just wanted to share is, if you ever get to Salt Lake City and you like dinosaurs, go to the Utah Museum of Natural History. I cannot recommend it enough. It's the most amazing place. They have set up this exhibit that has almost entirely skeletons that they found in Grand Staircase-Escalante. And I'm just going to show you some photos. These are photos that I took at the museum. I wish I had taken more, but I'm going to share with you just a few that I have here. So the one thing in this photo that you can't see very well, but I kind of want to point it out, way up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that neck going up if you can. If you were to see that in real life, I thought I got a picture of it and I didn't have it when I got home. But this neck must be 4 to 5 times as long as a giraffe's neck. It's an amazing thing, and it just goes up and up all the way into this really tall ceiling at the museum. It's just an amazing thing to see. And of course, the dinosaurs themselves, you can see 3 of them here, just incredible specimens here. Lots more that you can see. They've got them hanging from the roof. They've got them situated in lots of different places where you can see them. Here's a couple. This is obviously an adult and a baby or a youngster kind of dinosaur. I don't exactly know how that works. I don't know what these dinosaurs are, I should add. I didn't try to figure out what they were, but it's just such an amazing place to see these skeletons that are there. This is obviously a bird species here, a pretty big bird species, as you can see, but a remarkable example of some of the finds they've had down there. Here's another one. I think this is one of those species that were in that color slide that I showed you earlier, but again, a really remarkable kind of skeleton. And here's another little species. So in any event, just an amazing place, really worth a visit if you get a chance. I can't recommend it enough. If you like dinosaurs, this is the place to go. This is better than any dinosaur museum I've ever been to, just in terms of these kinds of examples. And it's pretty cool. And there are a lot of them. You can see the sign in the back, Kaparowitz Diversity, and there's a lot of information about Kaparowitz there. Because the other thing that's really neat about this place, by the way, is they have this whole area that's set aside where they're basically taking the bones out of the rock. I mean, so there's this whole processing area where they show you how they are actually doing this, and it's just amazing to see how this stuff works. So, if you get a chance, if you're in Salt Lake, it's kind of up on the hill a little bit outside of town, but it's maybe a couple miles away. But it's just a delightful place to visit and just a remarkable kind of place. And that's all I had. On the slide, and I'm happy to share the slides with anybody that'd like to see them, but I have written a few things on the Antiquities Act, largely because of my experience at the Interior Department. You can see one of them was done well before the Trump administration in the Georgia Law Review. That was shortly after I left Interior. And then this other one was more recent, which was done with some colleagues when we were trying to convince the courts that they should not allow Trump to diminish the monuments. And as I said, we wrote the article and we gave all our arguments for the court, but the court never ruled on it. So that's where we are. Okay, I'm done. Thank you very much. I'm sorry? We have time? Okay, good. Thank you. Yes, in the back.
Where did you say the museum was in Salt Lake City?
In Salt Lake City. It's amazing, isn't it?
What's it called again?
It's called the Utah Museum of Natural History.
Thank you.
Yes.
I want to ask a question of clarification. You said that co-management now is turned over to a third party.
Yes.
Okay. We were in, South Dakota,
Okay.
Yellowstone, and we were going to use our pass, our senior pass.
Right.
It had been turned over to some other company that would not,
Right.
would not recognize that.
Yeah. So this is something that I've been worried about. I've talked to the people who are working on these. Again, we call this co-stewardship now. It is not turning over the management of the property to a third party. And that was the concern originally, that maybe if you turned it over to a third party, even to a Native American community, they might be able to keep you off the land or make you pay even though you have a pass or whatever it might be. And so I know some of the people who are working on these issues, and they've assured me that that is not what's intended with these particular lands. You might be talking about national forest lands. I don't know for sure, but the National Forest Service, I think, has sometimes given their some of their fee areas over to private companies that then make you pay the fee when you go in. And I've been really annoyed by a lot of that stuff. I don't think it's right. I think I'd rather see the ranger there, even if I'm paying the fee. I'd rather pay the fee to the ranger and not to some private company that is just there to collect money, which is, it seems, what's going on. I'm sorry?
So you hope to standardize
Yes.
that practice
Yes.
then?
Yes, and
Okay.
to make sure we avoid the problem that you
Okay.
encountered. Yeah. Yes, in the back here. Okay.
Oddly, today I saw on the internet that a cliff that had collapsed in the Grand Canyon has now brought about studies that of geological importance that hadn't even been available before.
Yeah.
So I guess it continues. Now, who is in charge of allowing scientists to come in and do their work?
It would be the National Park Service regulates scientists coming in onto their properties, and they provide special access of all kinds. There's some really interesting ways in which that is done. My son, for a while, was a ranger down at Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, which is this massive cave area. And there are some amazing caves down there that are actually not open to the public for safety reasons and other reasons, but they let scientists down there under these special permits because they're discovering all kinds of interesting things. So the Park Service does a pretty good job of working with the scientific community to give access to places where they're making new discoveries and learning new things about these resources. And someday, hopefully these resources will be open to us to see as well. I mean, but I think you need to have the scientists in there first and make sure that we're preserving the resources that are there. Good point. Good question. Yes.
Hi, I was in Waco, Texas last fall and visited the Mammoth Monument.
Okay.
And was talking to one of the staff there who is actually a Baylor student as well in archaeology. And he was saying they've got a great display there of the mammoths and kind of half in the mud, half out of the mud and that kind of stuff. But he said there were mammoths all over that park, but that there was money to operate the park, but there was no money allocated to really do research or additional archaeological investigations. So is that independent? Do individual scientists have to get grants to come in and actually do that research and find, like you showed here at the Utah Museum, or is there federal funding to actually extend the research and grants, research and findings at these monuments?
It's a real mixed bag. So the government does have some research funding. They have research scientists on staff at many of the parks, not all. And so it really depends on the park and the resources that are available. If you spend any time recently, particularly in the major national parks, you will know that they are overcrowded with tourists. There are a lot of people going to the national parks. We are loving them to death, as they say. And a lot of the parks have put in these timed entry requirements. I have a place right adjacent to Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, and we've kind of got that all figured out now so that we know how things work and when we can get in. Of course, I have a pass. I have a senior pass, as it's called, so you get in for free to all the parks. But it's really a problem, except that I would say that the universities do have a fair amount of money to fund a lot of the work that's being done. Sometimes the researchers aren't aware of, or just there's not enough interest in a particular resource so that they're not coming to those places. That's unfortunate, it sounds like in this case, but there is a lot of both private and public money that is being spent on scientific research in the parks and outside the parks and in these national monuments. And I would say the bulk of it is probably private, but we have enough universities that are interested in these issues that they are stepping up in a fairly big way. Not completely, not as much as maybe we should, but certainly there is a lot of work that's going on in these areas. Yeah. Yes. Only Congress can designate a national park. I mean, that was kind of the early debate over the Antiquities Act, right? Because the Interior Department had wanted the president to be able to name a national park. But a couple things that Congress can only do: only Congress can designate a wilderness area, which is separate under the Wilderness Act. Only Congress can designate a national park under the National Parks Organic Act. And there are a number of other ways that the government can protect lands in addition to parks and wilderness areas. Obviously, the Antiquities Act is one, but there are also wildlife refuges and other kinds of protected areas. All the government agencies, by the way, the public land agencies, they have land use planning programs. And land use planning, it's a little bit complicated. I'll really simplify it here. It's kind of a zoning exercise. And so if you've got an important biological resource, for example, some kind of wildlife that you want to protect, you can zone that area to emphasize the protection of that resource in that particular area. And so it's not a designated monument or park or anything, but it could be a really large area that's being designed to protect bighorn sheep or mountain goats or whatever kind of resource you think is needed to protect that particular area. So there are a lot of tools, I guess, that the government can use that don't require Congress to act. But certainly if you're looking at national parks or wilderness areas, you need an act of Congress. Yes. Am I done? Sorry. Okay. One more? No? Okay.
All right.
Never mind. Sorry.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Jay Barth, the director of the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum. Mark, thank you so much for connecting the dots between the American presidency and all these weird critters that have been hanging around the Clinton Presidential Library for the last few months. So thank you. A super job. On behalf of the Clinton Library, the Clinton School of Public Service, and the Clinton Foundation, thank you all for being here and for your great questions. And for engaging in dialogue about this very important question that is very timely as the battle over these couple of key sites really shows. We thank you for being here tonight, but we thank you for all of your support for our programs. We can't wait to see you very soon right back here at the Clinton Presidential Center. So thank you all very much.